Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 9th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." And as Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples, then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, seeing her, he said, "Take heart, your daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout that district. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Now, were any of you tempted as a kid to pull that fire alarm or break the glass of the emergency box? I won't ask for a show of hands. And no, I'm not going to tell you that I ever did it on a dare from my friends, because I didn't, because I was the opposite. I was almost afraid to go anywhere near one of them for fear it might go off and I'd get in trouble. No, I'm the type that wouldn't even pull the alarm if I saw a fire, but would instead try to desperately look up the number for the nearest fire station and call. And yes, I know it doesn't work that way. So public service announcement clarification. If you need emergency services, call 911, because that's what they're there for. Trained and equipped and ready to help those in need. But you have to admit you need it to use it. Now, many times we were told that Jesus ate with those that were outcasts, or just even the more socially unacceptable or undesirable. An old-time way of maybe expressing it would be this: Jesus never cared about being proper and would associate with those beneath his station. Remember that phrase? But our passage today wants to highlight the differences between what Jesus wanted and what was thought then of as religiously correct. Sorry, I almost slipped there. Religiously correct. Because of that, it would be easy to spend time preaching and examining today how we ourselves judge and separate ourselves from others in what is now called othering people who are different from ourselves, to preach against creating divides, for divides based on anything other than what sports team you support is condemned by the Bible. So you Gator fans can still condemn those Knowles folks. But the passage has more to it than just a message about prejudices, judging others, and being welcoming and caring for all. It is also a stark contrast to how people respond to Jesus and how they deal with him. First up, a little clarification. Righteousness was not only a term referring to someone who was upright, respectable, honest, and trustworthy person. In terms of Judaism in Jesus' day, it meant someone who was part of God's people through the promise given to the descendants of Abraham, but also someone religiously practicing God's law correctly. And the opposite were the sinners. It didn't mean repeat criminals or people who flaunted moral standards. Sinners meant someone who, even if they were Jewish by blood, somehow was seen as not living up to the outward rules of the law as others decided it. These included laws about washing before meals and using certain dishware that are not listed in the Bible. These were outward signs of devotion that the Pharisees especially put extra emphasis on. And these rules, like avoiding eating out of cheap ceramic dishes or having special jars that could only be used for purification washing, these rules would have been hard for the common poor to observe. So they often were what referred to as the sinners and not the righteous. In our gospel today, as Jesus was entering town, he passes by a tax collection booth, which was quite common on the outskirts, and calls Matthew, even though tax collectors were seen as immoral for serving the Romans and cheating folks. And then Jesus goes into town, and gradually, as word spreads, those sinners show up and are included at the table with Jesus and his disciples. And by failing to exclude those who might not have washed properly, it was thought Jesus is also incurring their uncleanliness on himself. The Pharisees are concerned and shocked, to say the least. How can Jesus possibly be spreading the true word of God if he is debasing the importance of religious rules by accepting those type of people? But Jesus rebukes these religious elites. The healthy don't need to go to a doctor, but those who are sick. And then dismissively, he says, like a teacher to a disrespectful student, go and learn. God cares more about how we live than how we worship. It's worth looking at who approaches Jesus and who doesn't in our text. The tax collector comes and gives up his livelihood. The sinners, the not-so-religious folk, seek Jesus out. A woman who has some sort of bleeding issue which makes her ritually unclean, and a woman who shouldn't approach a man anyway in the street, she comes and risks getting help from Jesus, but just a touch of his cloak. And the synagogue leader, he is willing to bow before this controversial healer and risk his reputation for love of his daughter. And then, of course, we have the Pharisees who are so overwhelmed by the way people are being helped and healed, they also come to Jesus to meet him, right? No. They're the only ones who don't seek Jesus out. They don't even seek him out to talk shop and debate. They aren't seeking anything. They know they have what they already need from God. Jesus is right. They surely don't need anything from this God. It's not that the Pharisees didn't love God. They had dedicated their life to what they saw as proper worship and devotion to the Lord. But they don't need God the way the other people in our story did. And Jesus doesn't mince words with them. They probably felt insulted that Jesus didn't seek them out, try to convince them of his teaching, win them over. Why didn't Jesus spend time with the Pharisees? Why pick sinners over the righteous? Simple. He came not for those who don't need him, but for those who are desperate for God. So when do we call 911? Hopefully in an emergency. But when do we call on God? We shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much for calling on God when facing crises, death, or suffering. Don't we realize that most people call on God when it's an emergency, even if they're not church attenders? It's not only the people who are in church on Sunday who pray for help from God when confronted with things they can't deal with. Few are atheists when faced with insurmountable trouble. The tax collector was willing to break the emergency glass. The so-called sinners opened the God emergency case. The woman with the disease pulled the God alarm. The synagogue leader let out a loud 911 call. But the Pharisees, well, they knew they weren't in trouble. And so this question comes from the text to us today. Do we really need Jesus? I mean, we acknowledge having Jesus in our lives and knowing we can call on God when we need God, but how often do we really pull the alarm? I know in my own life, I have often lived like I am in charge, and I am confident that Jesus has my back if I mess up. You been there, folks? It's like I am in the driver's seat and Jesus is riding shotgun. I get in trouble, I know he will take the wheel, and he will. And it's great having confidence that I can do most things on my own and then call on God to come and clean up the mess if I can't. I mean, we do have a forgiving, ever-loving God who will always take us back when we come running for help. But does that mean that only running to God in trouble is a good model? Am I really living minute to minute with God if Jesus is just my panic button? When I am driving and talking a lot, Lisa knows that I will need reminding about where I am supposed to turn. But if I am so self-absorbed, I will sometimes even miss her frantic motions as we drive by our turn. And then I will hear the dreaded line, "Honey, you just missed our exit." How much better if I had been paying attention, listening as well as talking. It's easy to talk to God. Learning to really listen all the time, let's face it, it's harder. It's harder even to listen because sometimes, we know it all. Ever tried to have a real conversation with someone who knows they're right about everything? How'd that go? Like talking to a wall, isn't it? Ever wonder if God feels the same way? That's how God felt in Hosea, the passage we read. In Hosea, God sounds like a grandparent that the grandkids never call except when they need a favor. God says, "I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. In their distress, then they will beg my favor." Poor God. How often do we wait until we need arises, where God just wants us to call often and get help all the time? In Hosea, God gives up. Maybe I'll just go back to heaven until they seek me out again. Of course, when I was discerning whether to go into seminary and ministry, I sought God's will in prayer and the words of others fervently often. But how sensible would that be for deciding what I do with my day? I mean, I spent hours in prayer. What if you spent deep hour in prayer to figure out what to do in the next hour, and then, there goes your hour. So like the Pharisees, hours of prayer maybe isn't the right answer all the time. So why did the Pharisees, who were so devoted to God, miss it? And the, quote, sinners did not. The Pharisees were the ones praying and seeking God all the time. But the common folk who were hurting had more pressing problems. Why do I miss Lisa's helpful reminders until I've missed the turn? We need to need God in order to pay attention to God. The Pharisees knew they were doing all right with the fella upstairs. The others knew they needed God. The Pharisees knew about God. The others just needed God. It's not easy because we are confident that we can do it ourselves most of the time. But the faith that God desires is the humility of the woman that reached out for just a split-second touch of Jesus' robe. The submission of the synagogue leader that fell at Jesus' feet in desperation. The desire of the sinners that sought out where Jesus was. The openness of the tax collector that left everything behind. Humility, submission, desire, openness, all come from need. Jesus doesn't just want believers. Jesus doesn't just want worshipers. Jesus wants followers who need him all the time. Jesus certainly loves everyone, and Jesus is undoubtedly there for everyone, even if we don't pay attention to him most of the time. And Jesus will respond even if he only hears from us when we finally pull the alarm. But he really wants us every moment of every day, not just as a backup. He wants us to listen, not just ask. Jesus wants us to use him all the time, to really leave everything behind and follow him, to need him each and every minute. Amen. And our hymn of the day is "There's a Wideness in God's Mercy." Please stand as